It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Nick Butler, who's visiting professor and chair of the King's Policy Institute at King's College London. Nick is an investor in and advisor to a number of companies and institutions in the energy business. He's got an enormous amount of experience in the industry, having spent 30 years with BP. Actually, I think it's 29, Nick, is that right? I'm an accountant, so I get these things right. Including 5 years as Group Vice President for Policy and Strategy Development. He's also served as a Senior Policy Advisor at Number 10 and was Chairman of the Centre for European Reform and Treasurer of the Fabian Society. So please join me in welcoming Nick to the stage.
Dean, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, to come back to the London Business School. And I must say it's a striking pleasure to see how many people are so well dressed. I have a bet with my old boss from BP, John Brown. We were debating what it was that would not exist in the energy sector in 20 years' time. And his bet is that ties, men's ties, will not exist. I'll come back to what my bet was on. But it is a pleasure to be here. I don't want to give you a lecture, so I'm just going to talk for a little while, and I'd much rather have a discussion and to hear your views. But let me put some ideas in the room and just to open the day. Energy is clearly, once again, very much back on the public policy agenda in this country and internationally. People are concerned about the costs of energy and the bills that they are paying, and that, as you know here, is leading to a live debate on whether prices should be controlled by government with a price freeze. I think the industry itself and some governments are more concerned with the effect of falling prices. The oil price has fallen by 30% in the last 4 months, and that is beginning now to affect the budgets of all the oil exporting countries, Russia, and of course the North Sea, which is now at the stage of maturity where everything is marginal and where a fall in prices of that scale can have a dramatic effect. Then there's the issue of energy security, what's happening in Russia, what could happen in Ukraine, and how the European Union can and should respond. And then the shale gas, as you mentioned, the environmental impact. Shale gas development is banned in France, and it's making only very limited progress here in the UK, despite the good rhetoric from INEOS. And of course, there's climate change, which is not on the top of the agenda at the moment. It is not, there are not many sessions on it in most energy conferences, but it is still happening. The Arctic sea ice is still melting. There is increasing evidence that there is some relationship, ill-defined, between climate change and extreme weather conditions. And I think we're going to have a year prior to the Paris conference at the end of 2015 when the climate change debate comes back up the public policy agenda. But those are all public policy issues, and I think that we tend to ignore or underrate the corporate side of this, and that's what I want to concentrate on, the business side of the energy sector. Energy is a hybrid sector. It is a matter of public policy and private capital. And if the two are not aligned, the industry runs into problems. So I'm going to talk from a business perspective about the problems that I think the industry sees, the opportunities, and of course the uncertainties. Should remember that the energy business sector is very, very substantial globally. It is last year, the last figure from the International Energy Agency was that the investment needed in the sector over the next 15 years, this is just up to 2030, is over $6 trillion. And if we go to a seriously greener economy, that figure rises to over $7 trillion. That is quite a lot of money, particularly when you consider that 2/3 of it has to be invested in emerging market economies led by China and India, where the demand growth is greatest. So that's the context. I just want to put on the table the 4 issues which I think are preoccupying the companies within the sector. They may or may not be right to be preoccupied, but they are. The first is that point of changing geography. The data on China is quite remarkable. We've had more than 25 years now of growth of averaging 8 or 9%. That has lifted something over 600 million people out of subsistence life into the commercial economy where they can afford to buy energy for the first time. And all the studies show that as you come out of poverty, the first thing that you want to buy is energy, to provide the heat, light, and mobility that we take for granted. And that is exactly what has happened in China. Total energy demand is up 300% since 1990. It's up 60% in the last decade. Oil use has doubled in less than 10 years, and China, one country, now uses more than 22% of all the energy used in the world every day. If you remember the debates on, you're all too young, but the debates on energy security in the past, people were concerned with the Straits of Hormuz, which is one of the main transit routes for oil from the Gulf to the world market. That used to be seen as a pinch point which could damage energy security for Europe and the US. This year, on the figures, almost 90% of the oil going through the Straits of Hormuz goes eastwards, not westwards. There is an irony in that the war in Iraq, which many people think was fought for oil, almost all the oil from Iraq as it's developed will go to China and the East, not to the United States. And Chinese per capita consumption of energy is still very low. And I think that could rise quite sharply if the Chinese economy now adjusts from being led by industrial development to being led by consumer spending and consumption. And India, of course, is coming up behind that as well. By 2030, on the latest figures, India will have the largest population in the world. And again, per capita consumption is very low and all set to rise. And the question for the companies is whether the industry in this changing world will continue to be dominated by Western multinationals. The easy assumption is that the Western companies have the skills and the expertise and the money. But that is changing. The growth of skills in China in particular is remarkable. There were 10,000 PhD graduate engineers last year in China. There were 150,000 undergraduate engineers last year in China. And I think that if you combine the skills which are growing, and they are not trivial, some of the universities there are just as good as anything in this country or the United States. That level of skills which is growing year by year, plus the capital that the Chinese have, plus the flow of demand, I think there is now quite a likelihood that the next generation of business in this sector will be from Asia rather than from the West. And I think that that is leaving the Western companies I've worked for and many others, wondering what their comparative advantage is, what their long-term role in the industry is going to be. Are they just going to be left supplying what is in effect a shrinking market in Europe and the United States? Or are they going to be able to realign themselves in some way with this new the new market of Asia. That's one issue that is a preoccupation, and I don't think anybody has quite solved it yet. The second is climate change. And the issue now is not so much the evidence, whether climate change is real or not, whether there's a risk or not. Most companies accept that there is a risk. The science may be incomplete, but there is clearly a risk. But the question for the companies is how the world will respond to that risk and how they should respond. Current policies, current stated national policies, and the policy statements of many of the companies are built around the belief that there will be a global deal. And in Europe, they're built around the belief that that will start with a carbon price. All this is supposed to set us on a track to a low-carbon world, but it's not happening. There is no global deal. There was no global deal agreed at Copenhagen. I would be very surprised if there is a global deal agreed next year in Paris, because the interests of different countries are still so markedly different. India is rushing ahead and developing coal-fired power stations because it needs them for their immediate developmental requirements. The US, I think, is still politically constrained by divisions in Congress from going ahead with any serious initiative, and I would not bet on President Obama's plans to take coal out of the power sector surviving for the next 2 years. So the global deal begins to look rather more like the League of Nations, a well-intentioned but non-delivering initiative. And the question for the companies is how they deal in that world. How do they operate when the path that they thought they were on and playing their gradual part in is not there? They recognize the reality of climate change, but what are they now expected to do about it? Should they be staying in the sector, looking for more oil and gas and even coal, developing the industry that they've developed over the last 100 years, going further, going for deeper water, for shale, for the Arctic? Or should they be paying more attention to the opinions of the governments from which they come? In many cases, I was talking last night at the Statoil management meeting, where they come from a country where the Sovereign Wealth Fund has declared that it won't invest anymore in oil and gas because it believes in climate change and doesn't want to be contributing to climate change. I think the companies face these conflicts when there isn't a clear public policy direction. And the danger they face is that while some countries are doing rather little about climate change, some countries are doing quite a lot and will expect the companies to go along with them. And if they don't go along, they are in danger of becoming the new generation of tobacco companies. Companies that nice people don't want to invest in and don't want to work for. And this is a real dilemma for the industry. The third issue I'd put on the table is technology. We've seen the recent impact of shale gas. 10 years ago, when I was working in BP, we knew that shale gas existed, but we were absolutely convinced that it would not be commercial. It was barely mentioned within the company as a possibility because of that. If you go through the corporate strategy for 2006, which I was heavily involved in, it is not mentioned. And the speed of change has been remarkable. Now, what we don't know is the next technology and what the next impact of technology on the business is. And I wrote a little while ago about one possibility that I see, which is the integration of the retail market with information technology. That is, in a jargon phrase, Google Energy or Amazon Power. It is essentially the application of technology to the energy sector in a way that has already begun to transform other sectors. How might that work? Well, imagine that Google becomes the intermediary buyer and then seller of electricity, buying in volume at a discount which you can get if you do buy in volume from any supplier on the basis of price, and then selling on to the market, perhaps at a rather limited margin, perhaps at a lesser margin than the current retail business enjoys. They wouldn't need, Google Energy or Amazon Power would not need to own the suppliers, just as Amazon does not own the publishers. It is a well-established brand, it has huge capital, and it has a global reach. And it could be Amazon Power, it could be Walmart, it could be a major retailer, it could be a startup that does this. I think the technology, particularly as you go now to smart meters and smart grids, is making this very possible for somebody to get in the middle of the market and to produce a new offer. And the offers could vary. For people who want green energy, it could be a green offer. For people who are prepared to accept interruptible supplies, because that's the nature of their operation, their business, their home, a different offer. And it would be built on economies of scale and the ability to manage technology, which these big companies undoubtedly have. Now, it is just starting here in the UK. A company called OVO, which is very interesting, still quite small, growing quite quickly, very attractive in price terms. It's got to cope with the economic challenge of growth, as all smaller companies do, but it can be done. And I don't think that you could say that this can't happen. There's a famous story of one of the booksellers in the United States telling Jeff Bezos, who set up Amazon, that he had a very interesting idea, because all new ideas are interesting, but people loved bookshops. And selling online would be limited to people who were too ill to get to the bookshop and people who were disabled. And it was therefore a very niche, marginal business, and good luck with it. And that was only, I think, about 10 years ago. So I think that is one way in which technology can change the business. And the other way is my fourth and final point, which is that I think that technology is undermining the assumption, which underpins an awful lot of business strategies in the sector, that energy is scarce. I was brought up on a diet of belief around what had happened in the 1970s, the OPEC crises, the Club of Rome saying that resources would be exhausted by 1990, and that prices must inevitably rise, particularly as the supposedly easy fields were replaced by harder fields, more remote fields, things that were more difficult to develop. And that is still a mindset that you find within the industry at high levels. I think even now, when people see the price dip of the last few months, they say, oh, it's only temporary. This underlying reality of a fundamental price rise will come back. I think that ignores technology. Shale is one thing, but you see there are many others. There are new provinces that have been opened up in the last 10 years. There's deep water. There is increased recovery factors from existing fields, which can make a great difference. And on the other side, technology also affects demand. 5 years ago, the International Energy Agency were forecasting that oil demand and all the other forms of energy demand would rise to something like 135 million barrels a day by 2030. It's a very serious forecast, very serious, and well worked through. Now, only 5 years later, their forecast is that it will barely touch 100 million barrels a day. That is a big change in 5 years, and an awful lot of that is due to changes in efficiency, in the way energy is used, in cars, in homes, and that gain in efficiency has already had an effect. I'm always struck that the UK, which doesn't grow that rapidly, but has had growth at some level over the last 40 years, now uses a quarter less energy than it did in 1970. And we're seeing the technology has not finished. We're getting smart grids. We're also getting people understanding how to heat and light buildings. This room is, 5, 10 degrees too hot. The lights are wrong. But in a few years, you can have glass, and this is some excellent work being done on this in Cambridge, glass that absorbs and then releases energy and keeps to a median temperature that you set in advance. That is possible already. It's not quite commercial yet, but I don't see why it shouldn't be. And I think you also have great work going on now at MIT and Harvard on energy storage, and particularly electricity storage using biochemistry. And if that work breaks through, which I hope it will, I think it will, it absolutely changes the finances of all renewables, because we waste most of the solar that could be collected and the wind. If you could capture 5 or 10 times more of that and store it and use it when and where it's needed, that would be a remarkable shift. And I think the companies now face this dilemma of how they think about long-term prices. Should they be investing, as they have been for many years, on the basis of a gradual increase in real terms? Or should they now be thinking that that is a forecast which might be right, but which you can't intellectually sustain? And this is a big choice, and I think that they are still questioning whether this price fall now is the beginning of, or perhaps either a rather late step, a breaking of the old market and a structural change, or whether it's temporary. So my basic point to leave you with is that this is a great sector. It's huge investment. It's very interesting to work in at any level. Right around the world, it is global, but also very local as well. But it's not going to be the same in the future as it has been in the past. And the winners will be those who see the changes coming. And I've just quoted some. I could quote more. And you can disagree with them, but it won't be the same in one way or another. The winners will be those who can adapt, and the losers will be those who cling to old business models. And so as you listen to all the excellent speakers you've got in the next couple of days, I think that should be in your mind. Do they understand that this sector is growing, great sector, but a changing sector? Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take questions. Any questions? So please.
Yes, I think your presentation was very interesting. I'm from General Electric, from Oil and Gas. I think one element, I agree with all your points, first of all, but I think one key element is the cost structure in at least the petroleum industry. When the oil price was $110 or $120 per barrel, the oil industry had the luxury of producing the way they produce. When the prices are coming down, I think the oil industry will have to actually change the way it does its business. And qualification and bespoke approach leads to cost escalation, and all the projects are very complex. And I think we need to change the way you approach it. I think we need to have different collaboration models in the sector, and I'll leave it to that.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I've just been writing about this for my piece for the FT for next week, that the industry's immediate choice is what to do with their next generation of projects. They can squeeze down on the existing projects, try to get a bit more production out, but their real challenge is that if you take these price forecasts, or even current prices, seriously, which they have to, then they don't have a pipeline of projects for the future. Now, are they going to give up? No. The whole history of the last 100 years is the industry is very, very good at coping with change and volatility. And it will cope again, and it copes by looking at costs. I agree, people right through the sector have got used to a cost structure around $100, $110 a barrel, and comparable figures for gas. And they will now find ways of adjusting that downwards. I think it's going to be very challenging for the service sector, which has lived very well on these prices, but I'm sure they will find ways forward. Gentleman at the back.
Hi, I work for Shell in the strategy group. My question is actually also picking up on the oil price forecast. And how do you think, what is the impact of the oil price and continuing lower prices on the development of those alternative energies, which also benefit from subsidies, but also from the improved economics of having the alternative being just too expensive? So what is your take about that?
I think they will, what the lower prices do is expose the degree of subsidy that is required at the moment for most of those alternatives. And I think that the question comes back to whether there is a global deal or not. I think many countries will feel that climate change is serious and it's worth doing quite a lot and taking some cost to move to a cleaner, lower carbon economy, but not if other people are doing nothing. And if the only effect of using high-price renewables in Europe is to shift manufacturing and other business capacity to countries where standards are lower. So I think it all goes together. I think the interesting challenge now for the renewables sector is to reduce their own costs. And if I were them, I would be investing very heavily in the technology such as storage, which can transform their business. I think at the moment they are a public policy business. They're dangerously reliant on public policy in Germany, in this country, and a few other countries. And I was always taught that was not a serious business model to rely on for the long term. Gentlemen.
What's your views on the European regulations regarding barriers of entry to Chinese solar panels? There is pros and cons.
Well, I think the Chinese are clearly playing the market in order to cut out other suppliers. I think there is a degree of, well, some people call it dumping, but let's say aggressive trade behavior, which it is legitimate to negotiate about. I think, though, that the EU now needs export markets in China, and it has to be careful about retaining a balance of its dialogue with the Chinese. So I hope there's an issue. It may also be, of course, that the Chinese have found a way to really reduce costs. So this is not just subsidizing the panels, they're getting them they're able to produce them mass production at a seriously lower price, in which case they have a genuine comparative advantage.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Ingmar Wilhelm, Terra Firma. I've got a policy question for you. Why does it take so long in Europe to introduce competitive ways of allocating renewable capacity to, well, proponents, developers, investors? Whereas other countries, take Brazil or South Africa, have started implementing renewables, at least new renewable technologies, in particular wind and solar PV, exactly with auction mechanisms. Why are we so uncompetitive or struggling with the introduction of competition when developing renewables here in Europe?
Well, it's a big question. I think there are two aspects to it. One, it goes back to the previous question, that this is a business that is still dependent on public policy in many ways, not just subsidies. So it's dependent on these sort of decisions and therefore waiting for them, which if it was truly competitive, it wouldn't be waiting. It would just be doing the business. I think the other part of it is that Europe is still more a confederation than a single government. It's 28 national interests, 28 energy ministries, 28 treasuries, all of whom want to make sure that their interests are protected in any deal. And this is why we don't have a carbon price, because some people don't want a carbon price. When you have to get 28 countries all aligned, that is really very, very difficult. It is not, most countries do at least have a clear, fairly linear decision-making structure, and you know where to go to get the decision. In Europe, decisions are negotiated across the EU. And though I'm in favor of Europe, I agree completely that it is very inefficient for business trying to work here. One more? Any more? People are ready. Please.
I have a microphone. Tim Lyons, Orfid International. Of the $6 to $7 trillion that you mentioned the IEU suggested for in the next 15 years of investment, how much of that is focused on reducing consumption rather than sustaining supply?
Very little. Most of it is on extending supply, renewing and extending supply, in many cases to people who don't have that supply. It's particularly, I think the largest single element in it is building up the power sector in India, where it is badly needed, where there are still 300 million people who have no access to electricity. So this is just supplying unmet, at the moment, ineffective demand. You're perfectly right, we could do an awful lot more on reducing consumption.
How many dollars?
I haven't seen it broken out in a way that shows that, but I can imagine that it's very little indeed.
That's the problem, isn't it?
It is one of the problems, yes. Sir.
Good morning. Jim Briggs from Poton & Partners. I was just musing really on several of the things you mentioned because I'm old enough to have heard all these things before. The IOC has agonised about what possible role they could have when they were facing competition from small independents. This was back in the 80s and 90s, and they're still around. I think they'll still muddle through. They're still needed to fund the really big projects that are huge risks and huge technical challenges. I was also surprised by your suggestion about the Amazon model for the electricity and gas distribution business, because I thought we already had that in the UK. That's what the regulatory framework is supposed to be. And I think as far as trying to apply it to other countries, it's really back to policy. I live in New York. The system there is a local monopolies. They have a very nice life. Trying to shift them is a political issue, and I don't see really that much progress globally in that. I don't see it in Japan or Korea.
Right.
Okay. Depressing, but it's a political issue rather than somebody waking up one morning and saying, I'm going to be like Amazon. I think it needs the political will to push through those sort of regulatory changes.
Okay, let me take those two. First of all, on the IOCs, I agree they'll muddle through, or the best of them will muddle through. But I do think that dealing with this geographic shift in the market and the emergence of great new centers of demand that they are not used to working in is really very different from working with playing against the independents. I agree, they always feel threatened by something. That's the nature of business life. I think this is a more serious challenge because countries like China have the scope, the skills, and the capital behind them, plus the political support of the government in doing deals with supplying countries. That could make them, at some point over the next few years, really powerful challengers in the market. I think what the IOCs should do is get ahead of that and become suppliers of choice, bringing energy security, bringing resources, bringing skills, helping these countries. But you've got to take the initiative and do that. And I think I look forward to seeing one or two of them do it. I hope they will. On the Amazon point, I don't think I agree with you. I think that there's no regulatory barrier to doing it here, as OVO are finding. They have built up their business. I think they have several 100,000 customers now. It's just not been done. And it is the combination of the technology, the billing techniques, which is all the same thing, measurement, plus understanding the market sufficiently to become an informed buyer and then an informed seller. And that is effectively what Amazon did. Took them a little while, but they've become very powerful. I'm not saying that is exactly what will happen. I just think that you shouldn't assume that the integrated retail sector where people produce and then supply from their own production to consumers, domestic and business, is going to be the model in the next period. I think it will change. My suggestion is just one way it could change. There are others. But if you say that what we have is what we will always have, then I don't think that's right.
No, I don't think so, but I think it's a regulatory issue, and I think we've already
I don't think it needs any regulatory change now for Amazon or Tesco or Sainsbury's to become energy suppliers.
Not in the UK, but try doing it in the US.
Different country. It's not happened in the US yet, but I think Walmart are usually pretty good at getting regulations that they like if they want to do something. Any more? One more. Gentleman here, yes.
Hi, could you just share, I mean, you are involved in a lot of meetings with the senior management in the oil majors. So you're involved with senior management in oil major companies. Could you share what is the sentiment of those managements towards alternative energy and renewable energies?
Okay.
Do they genuinely believe that what the core strategy, which is focused on oil and gas, is good for the long term of the company, or do they feel trapped because they are pressured by the shareholders to generate cash and equity return in the short run? Thanks.
It's a very good question. I was involved when I worked in BP in the Beyond Petroleum initiative and the move into alternative energies, and I think that we found that we weren't doing it at the right scale, that it was too marginal within the company. What we wanted to do, and what I spent my last 2 years there working on, was to try to merge with Shell. And that would have been the whole company merging, but one part of it would have been to create a great renewables business, combining their renewables and ours. And the concept was that we would then take that outside the main company, hold a majority stake with the main funder and sell down over time. So it would start with 75% and come down. But that would have been a very serious big company ready to build over the long term. I think what's happened and that didn't work, of course. What's happened over time is that the companies have realized that their efforts in renewables are always going to be marginal to their main business. It's always possible, and as you say, shareholders want it, that you can make a better return by investing in the next oil and gas field than by going into renewables, which are, to go back to the earlier question, still dependent on public policy, which is something the big companies really don't like, because that public policy changes, particularly when governments see big companies coming in with big pockets, so why should we be subsidizing them? I think now the attitude in most of the majors is that over time, some renewables will come through, but they don't know which. They don't have the skills to invest in them all, so they will play second mover advantage. And when there are breakthroughs, when there are real steps forward, they will get involved, whether it's pushed by public policy or whether it's pushed by the real economics of technical change. They will then almost revert to their role as energy companies, go back and pick up what is winning. Now, you could say that's a cynical view. I think it's a perfectly rational business view. And I think that as the renewable sector moves on through technology, you will see the majors. They all watch what's happening. They probably all believe that in 50 years' time, renewables will be a very big slice of the global market, but that's a long time off, and it's well beyond the lifetime of any individual chief executive. One more.
You had one. Can I ask the embarrassing question? BP were very big in solar in the 80s, but then shut it all down.
Yeah, the economics didn't work, and I think the public subsidies changed. We had 2 or 3 goes at solar because people, the energy business, as you know, invests on a 40-year, 50-year time horizon, and they thought that on that time scale there would be serious renewables, and this was a way of getting into the market, but it was uneconomic, and it was very hard to justify capital investment when you had other things that could make a really quite simple and easy return that you really knew about. And so that's where it is now. They've stepped back. I think they're perfectly capable of stepping back in at the right moment. I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.